Assalamualaikum and a very good morning. My name is Dr. Fazilah Allaudin and I'm your moderator for this morning. Welcome back to day 2 of the NCCR 2020. We had a fruitful day 1 yesterday, officiated by the Honourable Minister of Health and followed by various talks and presentations. We also had the CRC named lecture called Battling Against COVID-19 by the Director General of Health. Today, we will have our Symposium 4 and also plenary talk by 3 speakers. And it is my pleasure today to moderate the Symposium 2, followed by plenary 4 today. Our first speaker today is Dr. Chew Cheng Hoon of the Institute of Clinical Research, the National Institute of Health, Malaysia. She is currently Doctorate of Public Health candidate at the National University of Malaysia, UKM. With her experience, skills, and passion in drugs and technology trials, ICT, and research and development, she will share with us the use of webinar in the era of COVID-19. And with that, the floor is yours, Dr. Cheng Hoon.
Thank you, Dr. Fazilah. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here for today's presentation. As you can see that based on Dr. Fazilah's introduction and also on the bottom below here, you know my title is more focused on the webinar and what we do during the COVID-19. We actually started a webinar to actually share information with the healthcare workers. So here are my layouts. So I'm going to share a few information and our experience and how we go about. So, from clueless to emergency transition, nobody can doubt that COVID-19 really caught us all off guard, and it is really like this picture here. You can see that it is all like, fire ongoing and so messed up, and SpongeBob in his brain is like, okay, panic, chaos and all. Actually, this morning is also quite chaotic. Just now, at this maybe 30 minutes before the webinars get live, Prezi actually down, and this is an AR Prezi presentation where I need internet, I need the Prezi server to go live, and it completely shut. I was like, oh my God, how am I going to do? What is my backup plan? So luckily, fortunately, thank you Prezi for going live again for this. If not, I will have to last minute come up with something else, and I'm very grateful for everything that turns out well. And that's what happened when you go live or webinar. You will never know what will happen until the very last moment you go live. When you go live, something can happen too. So you have to really figure out what to do when the things happen. So this is one of the examples, and I'm grateful that I managed to go live with you all now. So what is the main aim of this webinar that we do? The main aim of this webinar is to empower healthcare workers working in Malaysia to get the latest information about clinical updates in COVID-19 directly from the experts who are managing COVID-19 to our healthcare workers, no matter where they are, in a timely, accessible and free of charge. That's very important. We want to empower everyone with the correct understanding and information throughout this COVID-19, and we need to battle it with the correct way and also to safeguard all our healthcare workers. So that is the emergency transition that we have to go into, and you wonder why and how did we do the webinar. So why did we do this webinar? Because of two things. That's COVID-19 disruption, as you can see, and also the infodemic thing. So I'll go into one point by one point. So when I talk about COVID-19 disruption, here is an overall view of the cases of COVID-19 in Malaysia. First, we had the first wave in late January, just a few cases, and then it died off a cool 11 days without cases, and then second wave come about in late February. And then after that, around 13th of March, then we decided that the cases are getting up, and we are a bit worried. We need to actually empower all our healthcare workers with information. So the clinicians and people, all of us, the researchers in ICR, have discussed that we need to empower the healthcare workers with the correct CNE information. And we discussed with DG and we got approval and we started our webinar. So tentatively, 7 days later, from 13th of March, is our first clinical updates in COVID-19. And 1 day before our webinar, MCO happened. Then when MCO happened, suddenly everything stopped. So it disrupted everyone's life. So there's no more CME, no more physical contact, no more going out. Everyone is at home. So now we have to think how to bring the speaker on board and how we still need to go on with this, and we cannot stop. So this is what we have to do. And another reason for this is that, as you can see, here is a few newspaper article cuttings that I'm sharing with you. One is from International. So in overseas, final year medical students are actually being rushed into front line. They are nervous, but they are ready to serve. Same thing, in our MOH, we're also mobilizing staff to become frontliners to help out with the COVID-19 battle. And at the same time, MOH also wrote in 1,000 housemen to contribute and help in the hospital, but they are not directly contact with the front line in the COVID-19. But we have young MOs who are new to the after housemanship, and our young nurses who have been in service not too long ago, and our MAs, all of them need to know what is the right thing to do to empower and to actually make sure they handle themselves properly, taking care of themselves, and also to safeguard and to treat the patient. So we have to give the information out. This is why the COVID-19 disruption is here. And the next part I'm going to focus on is actually on infodemic. Infodemic, this is a quote from our WHO DG. He said, "We are not just fighting an epidemic, we are fighting an infodemic." Infodemic comes from two words, information epidemic. That means there's so much information produced digitally every day. So whether it's social media or website or blogs, and including WhatsApp or our chats, people are just forwarding information. Sometimes the fake news or misinformation look more authentic than actually real news. Sometimes it's difficult even to differentiate what is real, what is fake, what sounds correct but may not be correct. So what's logical may not necessarily be the truth. So we have to, and it's an urgent need to provide timely and accurate information to dispel this infodemic. So these are the two reasons why we need to do it. And that's how we come out on the 19th of March 2020. We successfully have our first session on clinical updates in COVID-19 webinar. So we started at 12 p.m. and we finished at 2 p.m. Malaysia time. And from then on, we start every Thursday to have these clinical updates in COVID-19 with all our healthcare workers. And what did we learn? So I would like to share with you on this. This is a quote from Thomas Edison that he said that I have not failed. I just found 10,000 ways that won't work. Well, I'm very grateful, and we are very grateful for everyone who gave us feedback from the beginning of our webinar until today. I'll just share with you some of our earlier experience that is not so smooth going. So these are some of the feedback we get earlier on. Okay, audio is very important for webinar, and we have audio issue because on the first webinar, we have overwhelming of participants and we cannot support them. And during lockdown, we cannot buy new equipment, we cannot get new services. We have to make use with what is available, the available resources, that's all we have. So we have to think of innovative way to go about. So I decided to use a phone, to do a Twitter Periscope live TV that put on a tripod next to the LCD screen and rebroadcast, and the audio wasn't great. And the camera cannot be directly in front because you have your moderator and the speakers there, so they need to have the main view. So it was slanted, so our participants have to tilt their head a little bit to follow on the webinar. So these are the feedback, and some of them even suggested what are the alternatives and what preference they have when they go online or watch online, whether it's on YouTube or Facebook Live and so on. So we take everyone's advice into consideration. And then later on, so we started to have positive feedback about, let's say, the fourth webinar onwards. So as you can see on the top here, there is a video of Prof. Fazilah from UN giving a talk. And at that session, it was a bit cute to hear someone who actually commented, is this a live TV broadcast or is this a TV show ongoing? And we find it a little bit funny because we're just ordinary people trying to share clinical updates in COVID-19, and we started to have positive feedback via email and also on social media. And we're very grateful for everyone, and we continue to listen and strive to improve after each session. Even now, if you want to provide us feedback, we are welcome and we will listen to your suggestion. So next thing I would like to share with you is the power of social media. There's no doubt social media is very important now. Even infodemics are happening because of our social media enabling on this. So when we cannot cope with too many participants on Zoom or Cisco WebEx on the initial stage, we actually go on broadcast live in all the social media platforms that it's available to go on live broadcast. That is Facebook Live, YouTube Live, Twitter and Periscope TV. We run concurrently, means when we go live on Zoom, we also go live on all these four social media platforms. So everyone can watch live together. Nobody is missed out in this. So we can notice that majority of our participants come from Facebook Live. So Malaysians prefer Facebook Live when they come on board on webinar, and then subsequently international audience come on board using YouTube and also Periscope TV or Twitter Live. So later I will emphasize a little bit on the importance of hashtag. Now, potential gaps. When one of the webinar, when we are talking about frontliners, about mental health on the community and also on our frontliner, so they've taught out on an issue where the students are learning with difficulty because of online learning. So not everyone have unlimited internet. And we even heard one story of one student living in the rural area that they had to climb up a tree to get better coverage connection to study, to do their online learning. So in that case, that got me to thinking, did we neglect any healthcare workers? Did we miss them out when we are doing this COVID-19 updates? So there may be possible that the frontliner are too busy or no time to watch the live webinar when we're going live. Or some of us may have different learning skill. So some of us would like to watch video, some would like to listen to teaching, or some may even like to read books, text. They do not want to be on the audio or visual. So every one of us are unique. We have different learning methods. So we think of that in the consideration. And lastly, we have healthcare workers who are working in rural or far away district area where the internet coverage may not be optimal and they may not have unlimited internet like some of us who are in actually urban area. So how do we deal about this? It's important to address this, I guess. So we come up into more alternative solution. Number one, we have a dedicated YouTube channel, as you can see. So this YouTube channel will allow any healthcare workers to watch the video after the event. So we go live on YouTube, and after that, you can watch it at any time or you can repeat it also. And then subsequently, the audio version, we converted into a podcast, a fully audio version, and upload into the majority of the audio podcast platform, including Spotify, and then Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and so on. So you can see some of your other favorite podcast channel or the platform here that's available. The last one, we actually make it available as ebook in multiple formats for your comfort to read. It can be EPUB, PDF, or even plain text on the major ebook platform. So you can download the transcript in that format to actually read it. So besides that, we also heard that many of our healthcare workers are actually watching the webinar live using mobile device or only single device alone. So when you watch live using YouTube or using Facebook Live, when they need to ask questions, we actually standardize everyone to use a unified Slido Q&A question. So they may need to leave their platform, social media platform, to ask questions in Slido. So when they leave, they may miss out some questions that are being addressed or some of the answers are being discussed. So we do not want anyone to miss out on the discussion. So we come out with this website, where NIH website and the COVID-19 blog are two alternative websites where you can watch the YouTube live embedded together, and below it is actually the Slido Q&A. So you can have the question asked at the same time and listen to what's going on, and you do not miss anything. That's what we do to ensure that it's appropriate for everyone. And then we listen to some of you who actually say that we would like to get CME points as well. So because our webinar is recognized by all our CPD regulatory bodies in Malaysia, MMA, MyCPD, and NSR CPD, so some of them would like to get CPD points after the live webinar. So we come up with an NIH online CME platform where you can take the course on your own time. As a self-paced, we do not limit the duration of the time. So after you watch the live YouTube webinar or listen or watch or read the ebook, then you answer a self-assessment question. When you pass, then you will get actually the certificate for your CME points as well. So we will upload the CME points for you. So these are what are the things that we actually come up with. Now, after all this, there's something that we did not expect. Our webinar has become international webinar along the way that we did not realize that it happened. So these are the list of the countries that is listed on Spotify. So these are the numbers of the countries our participants are actually tuning live. We are tuning into Spotify to listen to our webinar. So as the red rectangle you can see are actually the top 10 countries who watch our YouTube live video or subsequent recorded YouTube from the clinical updates of COVID-19. But I would like to highlight a unique point is that Pakistan only follow us on YouTube, but they do not actually follow us on Spotify. That's a unique standout that I can see. And besides that, we noticed that our webinar also being cited by newspaper and also some medical journals like NIMS, Code Blue, and so on. And these are some examples of the snapshot of the article being featured. And then, as I mentioned just now about hashtag discovery, the unique part about hashtag is that when we update our webinar for the upcoming webinar, so we use relevant hashtag to let our participants know what is it about. So we use one of the hashtag called HPM Global. HPM Global stands for Hospice and Palliative Medicine Global. So this hashtag is very unique. I didn't know that. So we have a webinar on vulnerable population during COVID-19 pandemic, which cover about palliative care and how our palliative care services in the country continue to run despite MCO or the lockdown that we have. So it was featured into HPM Global online magazine and also onto their Twitter group. So people are watching the Twitter hashtag or this hashtag on internet. So it's very important to focus on social media hashtag when actually you're doing something meaningful. So the next thing is that sharing here with you is an Appy bot. So on Twitter, there is actually Twitter bots. So I heard about Twitter bots, but I don't really know what they do about, and it wasn't my interest in the earlier days. But to my surprise, when I tweet one of our webinar using Appy Twitter, it actually got featured into Twitter bot. So Twitter bot actually will retweet certain tweets using Appy Twitter under the certain algorithm. So when the things are meaningful or within in line with their work, they will actually retweet your tweets. So that will also another way you get a bigger coverage globally as well. So, and then we also very fortunate that the WHO COVID-19 education team also included our clinical updates in COVID webinar into their website platform. So this is their platform where our webinar is being featured there, the YouTube and also the Twitter updates. So here are my final thoughts. Every challenge is an opportunity to succeed. So we may not know everything, but as long as you're willing to take the first step to explore, the sky is the limit. Together, we can win this COVID-19 fight. That's all I can say. And please don't be afraid to try new things. To tell you the truth, I have a confession to make. Using this as a presentation way, AR, Prezi, it's a augmented reality presentation style. It's new to me. I've never used this in my life. This is my first time using it. And unfortunately, 30 minutes before the webinar go live, the server actually went down. I was a bit caught off guard. Also, I have alternative plans in case it didn't work out. But fortunately, I'm very grateful that Prezi went online so quickly, and I managed to use this to present to you all. And okay, so there is actually a list of social media here. You can also talk to us and follow up or direct message to us if you have any feedback and comment. Thank you very much. And I would like to introduce to you my friend here, Yan Yi. She is very important person. She's the one with me all the time throughout this COVID-19 pandemic, MCO, CMCO time, whereby she actually stay up 24/7 with me to work out to make sure this webinar go live and all the resources are timely out for all our healthcare workers. Without her, things will not be able to work so well. And also we have a team behind, but she's one of the key person that I'd like to share and introduce to you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Cheng Hoon, and also, of course, to Yan Li. And if you know, both of them are the main player behind our weekly update on COVID-19. And as mentioned by you, Dr. Cheng Hoon, we are not just fighting an epidemic, we are also fighting an infodemic. So there are some questions. If anyone would like to post, you can post the questions on the Q&A box or the chat box. There's one question here today, Dr. Cheng Hoon. How do we choose, or what is the criteria for a suitable platform for a webinar?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. And I think that is a very important question. Number one, you need to know your resources. What is your internet bandwidth? Do you have a high-speed unlimited internet, or your internet infrastructure is limited? So if you are limited internet infrastructure, I would suggest Zoom. Zoom is quite lean. They require a minimum bandwidth. So other platform is possible, but they may use a little bit more bandwidth. So you have a better internet connection speed, you can use other alternative platform. So for me, from my experience, Zoom is quite good in a low internet setting. And of course, you have a simple laptop with your inbuilt webcam and inbuilt microphone will do. That's all you need to go live on the webinar. And there's a free alternative that you can share it on YouTube or Facebook Live if you have that account.
Yeah, thank you. And one more question. A lot have been mentioned about security and also especially on Zoom and so forth. Is there any advice you would like to give to the audience?
Follow Zoom update. Follow closely on all the video conference, what they share with you, the updates, security updates, and so on, and have best practice. Do not share your password and your login key on social media like a lot of people do. Zoom bombing happened because of people conveniently share their meeting keyword and password, everything online. So anyone can drop in when they know you're having it in advance before that. So as long as you keep it discreet and only share with the participants, it will be good. Having a waiting room to only invite letting people you know to come in is also an alternative. So you need someone to watch out safely, securely, and you also can lock down the room after the meeting started so that it will not be an issue. So these are the few things you can do.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Cheng Hun. And now, sorry, there's one more question. We'll take this question. Were there IT or AV people at the NCCR conference during the webinar now?
Actually, I find the AR Prezi is quite easy to use. Of course, I come in early to actually share with the team that what I'm going to do and set up the thing. So everything went very well, except when the glitches happened, then the IT team came about, the secretariat all came about to help me. And then Yanni found out that the system is down. So everyone said, okay, nothing we can do. So we go to plan B. But luckily, they're back to plan A.
Thank you. My advice is always have plan A and plan B. All right. Thank you. Thank you again, Dr. Cheng Hun. Next, we'll move to our next speaker, Dr. Kuldeep Kaur, Hospital Director of Sungai Buloh Hospital, the main admitting hospital for COVID-19. Dr. Kuldeep is well respected as hospital administrator and has held various leadership roles in hospital administration. As the hospital director of the primary hospital for COVID-19, Dr. Kuldeep has transformed the hospital to suit the requirement of a full COVID-19 hospital. It's a pleasure today to hear her on the strategies in the pandemic preparedness as the COVID-19 hospital. To you, Dr. Kuldeep. Dr. Kuldeep, we are unable to hear you. So as you see, these are some of the issues and challenges you have when we are doing webinar, but we are learning as we go on, and we are trying to solve for Dr. Kuldeep. As you are very much aware, Hospital Sungai Buloh was the primary hospital that was set up for during the COVID, and we had 7 hospitals that was dedicated as a full COVID hospital. So Dr. Kuldeep today will share with us her experience in setting up this hospital as a full COVID hospital. Sorry, Dr. Kuldeep, we are unable to hear you now. Perhaps we can move to the next speaker while we try to sort it out. Is that okay, Dr. Kuldeep? Yeah? Okay, so I think due to some technical glitches, we will try to come back to Dr. Kuldeep. We will continue to our plenary 4 session on COVID-19 or the future. And with us today, we have Professor Ogan Gurel to enlighten us on new paradigm in medicine and healthcare. Prof. Ogan Gurel is a visiting professor at the Daegu Gyeongbuk Institute of Science and Technology, Korea. Over 35 years, he has held various roles in multiple sectors with domain expertise in medical devices, digital health, molecular biophysics, and medical imaging. Prof. Gurel is currently the advisor for the CREST Malaysia Digital Healthcare Cluster. With great pleasure, I hand over to Prof. Ogan Gurel.
Thank you very much, Dr. Allaudin, for the kind introduction. Thank you to all for joining us at NCCR 2020. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here, although a little bit sad actually, because as Dr. Allaudin mentioned, I'm an advisor with CREST Malaysia, and I was there in October. And it's sad that because of the pandemic, I won't have a chance to see my friends there and colleagues. So I'm sorry for that, but it's very good that we can use technology as outlined by the previous speaker via webinar to bring us together here. And so indeed, my topic is COVID-19 in the Future, New Paradigms in Medicine and Healthcare. And I will share my screen now. And as Dr. Allaudin mentioned, I'm a professor at Solbridge International School of Business, a professor at DGIST, and I also work with several startups in healthcare. And the topic for today is COVID-19 in the Future, New Paradigms in Medicine and Healthcare. So one of the big issues that we've been talking about today is what are we doing now? What is the status of COVID-19? We were supposed to hear from the previous speaker. I will speak a little bit about future technologies, future paradigms that may help with COVID because this is going to go on for a while, but maybe more for the future. And one of the particular reasons why this is very relevant for Malaysia is that some of these concepts relate to electronics, and Malaysia has a significant expertise in electronics. There's a significant electronics industry. In fact, CREST is an important part of that ecosystem and sector. And so this also represents some opportunities for Malaysia as well. So I start with a quote here from Immanuel Kant: "Two things fill the mind with ever increasing admiration and awe, the starry heavens above and the moral law within." That quote is a little bit philosophical, obviously, but it will become relevant in terms of medicine and science and what I will be talking about later on in this presentation. So the outline for the presentation will take 4 parts. I'll raise some key motivating questions. I'll talk about some fundamentals of this science that represents the future of healthcare, some research results, including those related to COVID-19, and applications. Great, so let me start from the beginning. Again, my topic is COVID-19 in the Future, New Paradigms in Medicine and Health. And if there is one take-home message that you take away from the next 40 minutes or so, it's this picture of a protein. Proteins are very important, of course, with viruses and so forth. And this protein is vibrating, and that's a key visual that I hope you'll take away from this presentation. So as I mentioned very briefly at the beginning, and we had a little technical glitch, 2 things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the starry heavens above and the moral law within. This is from the famous German philosopher Immanuel Kant. So the outline of this presentation is going to take 4 parts. First are some key questions. Second will be some fundamentals. Third will be some research results, including those pertinent to COVID-19. And fourth will be some applications that relate more generally to medicine as well as with COVID-19. As I mentioned at the outset of the presentation, we had these technical glitches. I think these concepts are very important for Malaysia, and in particular with CREST, because it relates to certain technologies that Malaysia has strengths and where the ecosystem may play an important role in facilitating this future of healthcare. So now to key questions. First question, why is COVID such a big problem? Second question is, what is the future of diagnosis? Third is, what is the future of therapy? Fourth is, what is the future of technology? And fifth is, how does life work? So why is COVID-19 such a big problem? First of all, we need to understand, as many of you already do, of course, is what is a virus? A virus is essentially genetic material contained within an organic particle that invades living cells and uses the host's metabolic machinery to produce new virus particles. That is a virus, and that's a little bit technical, but the key question related to this definition of the virus is, what are viruses in terms of, are they living? Are viruses alive, simply put? So, as we know, the virus has 3 parts from inside to outside: an inner nucleic acid, which in this case is RNA, a lipid membrane, and thirdly, a spike protein. The nucleic acid determines the genetic material. It can mutate with implications for immunity and vaccines. It's used for testing. The lipid envelope determines the environmental viability, and so we call these envelope viruses. So that's one reason why soap and alcohol disrupt this membrane. It is essentially like a fatty surface. And thirdly, and very importantly, is the spike protein. The spike protein determines the target, the ACE2 protein in human cells. It's blocked by antibodies, and it's also used for various types of testing. So nucleic acid, spike protein, and lipid membrane. So back to the question, are viruses alive? The essential answer is no, viruses are not alive, so you can't technically kill them. There are only two ways to get rid of the virus. One is to physically destroy it, and the second to have it cleared by the immune system. So this has very important implications in terms of antivirals, in terms of vaccines, and in terms of social measures, etc. It's not exactly like many other diseases, and certainly not like bacterial diseases, where a drug in many cases can effectively kill it. Viruses, we have to basically do other approaches to address the problem. So antibiotics don't exist for viruses. Everyone knows about antivirals though. What are those? Well, unlike miracle antibiotics, which kill bacteria, antivirals cannot kill viruses. One cannot kill that which is not alive, as I mentioned. So antivirals basically block, slow down various processes in the cell. This is a little bit of a complicated slide, but it shows you that the virus gets into the cell, the virus hijacks the cell's machinery, as I outlined, and then produces new viruses. So in red, you can see various antiviral strategies, from blocking fusion to blocking endocytosis, or bringing the virus into the cell. Hydroxychloroquine, which has been much mentioned, works at this step. Interfering with proteolysis, so ritonavir, remdesivir, interfere with translation and RNA replication. There's also packaging and virus release. So these are various points at which antivirals have some effect, but they don't effectively kill the virus. They slow down the virus, allowing the immune system to clear it. So what is the future of diagnosis? On this table you can see here various modalities for diagnosis in medical imaging, from X-rays to ultrasound to MRI to PET scans. And one key point is that essentially no new modalities have emerged since the early 1980s. You see a lot of innovation towards the right here, and this sort of innovation is what we would call incremental innovation, building on existing modalities. So the future of diagnosis or medical imaging should imply that perhaps there are new modalities that we can use for imaging viral infections, better imaging of cancer, better imaging of conditions in medicine. So what is the future of therapy? This is a chart of new drugs as a function of research dollars over time. And you can see that the number of new drugs per research dollars has been steadily decreasing. And in fact, since the turn of the century, about $1 billion for one drug to produce. So apart from incremental advances, we have some level of innovation being stalled in biopharma as well. George Yancopoulos, a very prominent executive in the pharmaceutical industry, wrote that successfully inventing and developing any new drug or vaccine is quantifiably among the hardest things that human beings try to do. So drug development is exceedingly difficult. So the future of therapy should imply new approaches, new paradigms to treating disease. And that's what we will talk about today as well. Fourthly, what is the future of technology? There is an approach to predicting the future of technology, and people at CREST and other government agencies are always trying to understand what is the future of technology, how can we align what benefits people, how can we align the economic ecosystem and so forth to meet future technologies. And we can often predict the future of technology, maybe not the specifics or bet on specific companies or stocks, etc., but the overall themes of technology progress in predictable ways. So for example, a immovable system will eventually have multiple parts and eventually involve some sort of energy aspect. We call this technique of predicting the future of technology TRIZ. So for example, a steering wheel goes from rigid all the way to electrical steering. A door goes from a single leaf door all the way to a Star Wars-like light lock. And landlines or wired connections go to wireless and so forth. So in medicine, what is the current technological paradigm? The current technological paradigm is what we would call a matter-on-matter paradigm. A drug has to physically bind to a target protein. Remember I mentioned about proteins being important in this presentation. Or a instrument or hand has to physically touch a target tissues in the case of surgery. We call this a matter-on-matter paradigm. The future, again, going by this evolutionary prediction, will inevitably be an energy-on-matter paradigm. And that is the future paradigm of medicine. The last question, motivating question, the big picture question, if you will, is how does life work? This is a little bit of a spaghetti diagram, but it is what is called a proteome or interactome of a proteome. In other words, each of the nodes on this diagram is a protein. In the yeast, which is a unicellular organism, eukaryotic organism used for a lot of research studies. Of course, the same can be said for human cells in a more complicated way. But essentially, each node is a protein, and the lines between them represent the interactions between different proteins. And essentially, life progresses because one protein binds or interacts with another protein. But this is all very remarkable. And in fact, how does this work at the speed of light? How can we think? How can we move? How can we talk? All of these activities happening very quickly just by the random bumping together of proteins. That, of course, is the paradigm of molecular biology. But there may be other ways that the proteins are interacting over a distance and some sort of interactions that are facilitated to enable more directed interactions, if you will. And I'll reference this as a fundamental question that this concept will relate to. So where do we go from here? What might be the future paradigms for COVID-19? What will be the future of medicine and healthcare more generally? And how can we better understand the fundamental mechanisms of life? So the story of this paradigm, at least my involvement in it, begins over 30 years ago. Proteins are neither solid nor liquid. They are something in between. This is my professor, Martin Karplus, who was my thesis advisor in 1985, 1986, and he was one of the pioneers in what's called molecular dynamics of biological macromolecules, and a pioneer in protein dynamics. So let's now talk about the fundamentals. Fundamentals, what are proteins? What are the axioms of protein electrodynamics? What are some scientific questions? What is terahertz and what is terahertz medicine? So we're getting more specific here. Proteins, what do they look like? These are two representative proteins. They are the machinery of life. That's how we do all the activities of life in the cells. They are the targets of drugs, and they are also the targets of vaccines, as well as the targets of viruses. So some representative proteins are myoglobin. This is a oxygen carrying protein. Basic fibroblast growth factor. This is the androgen receptor. This is human growth factor. The point of this slide is to show you that proteins have all different sizes and shapes and so forth. And what do they do? Well, basically they do everything. They're structural proteins like collagen, storage proteins like the myoglobin I showed, transport proteins, which we'll see some examples, hormones, receptor proteins like the ACE protein, which is a receptor for the SARS spike protein, contractile proteins like actin and myosin in the muscles, defensive proteins like antibodies, and of course, enzymes. So here's an example of the voltage-dependent potassium channel that's involved in the nerve impulse. And you can see here that this potassium channel is moving. It has these large-scale movements. So many of you have heard of nanotechnology as a new technology, but the original nanotechnology, the original nano machines are in fact these proteins, where they're like little machines that open and close. So this channel opens and closes for potassium to go through. So that is the voltage-dependent potassium channel. So we bring all these concepts together in what I call protein electrodynamics, which is the fundamental paradigm that I will describe here. So as I mentioned, proteins are vibrating. They are not like Martin Karplus, they are not, as Martin Karplus taught us, they're not static, but they are like liquid and solid in between. So you can see this vibrating protein. Number two, proteins are charged. So they have positive and negative charges on them. So this is the acetylcholinesterase protein. It has negative charges inside the binding site here and positive charges around it. And then there's, of course, Maxwell's equations or the laws of electromagnetism, which dictate how radios, how smartphones, how all our devices work. These Maxwell's equations basically say that vibrating charges will either emit or absorb electromagnetic radiation. And therefore, proteins emit radiation, and proteins also absorb radiation. That means these proteins are like little radios. We can detect them, and we can influence them at a distance. And these are what I call axioms of protein electrodynamics. So as I mentioned, Martin Karplus and others taught us that proteins vibrate. This is the original paper in Nature in 1977. And he got the Nobel Prize partially for this work in 2013. So this is a very established area of basic science, namely protein dynamics. So here are some examples. Proteins vibrate. So you can see here, this one. This is glucosamine 6-phosphate deaminase, and it's not a static molecule, it's vibrating. Here's another one. This is a protein with cysteine coordinated with zinc. So there's a little bit of a zooming in of that. You can see water molecules popping in and out. Here's another one, beta-galactosidase. And here's a fourth one, xylanase, the molecular dynamic simulation of the protein vibrating. So how do we know this? Not just the theoretical studies. There's a technique called inelastic neutron scattering, where we can measure the softness of a protein. This is Giuseppe Zacchi, who I worked with also back in the late 1980s out of France. And based on that, the neutron scattering, Jeremy Smith, also was a former postdoc in the Martin Karplus lab, did myoglobin, that protein I showed you. So this is the theory, this is the experiment. And it turns out that the proteins are in this terahertz and sub-terahertz range, about 0.45 to 0.6 terahertz in the case of this myoglobin. That's the peak vibration. So this is about 450 to 600 gigahertz. So for proteins, low terahertz and high frequency infrared motions are different. So infrared is insensitive to the backbone motions. Infrared is the infrared thermometer. It's related to heat. The differences between proteins are washed out. So many proteins have these similar structures. But with terahertz, and I'll show you these results later, the differences between proteins, even similar ones, are apparent. And large scale motions, as I showed you with that potassium channel, are responsible for the protein function, which is how drugs interfere with these proteins and interfere with their function. So if we compare infrared to terahertz, we see that the terahertz motions are more related to potential diagnosis and are more related to potential treatment methods. So some scientific questions. Do proteins vibrate at different frequencies? Yes. Can we identify different proteins based on their spectrum? Yes, but it's not easy. Protein anharmicity, is it significant? It may depend. Can one influence protein function by modulating their vibrations? This is unknown. How far might these electromagnetic fields propagate? Maybe 1 millimeter. Could protein electrodynamics mediate specific interactions between proteins? In other words, one protein has an electromagnetic field and influencing another protein. And could proteins communicate over a distance? These scientific questions underlie the applications to diagnosis and treatments. So let's go into a little bit of the physics. What is terahertz? Terahertz is the electromagnetic energies between the microwave on the low energy side and the infrared on the high energy side, corresponding to 10 to the 12 cycles per second. Until recently, it's been very difficult to engineer this radiation because it lies between what we call the electronics regime and the photonics regime. So there are two different methods of producing radiation. One is using unbound electrons in electronics, and the other one is using bound electrons in photonics. But ironically, terahertz is all around us, emitted by all living organisms, as we are all composed of proteins. So we are actually emitting naturally terahertz by these proteins that we have. It should also be noted that terahertz waves are strongly absorbed by water. So this represents an opportunity as well as a challenge. And then in an engineering standpoint, terahertz is the last frontier in the electromagnetic spectrum. Microwave, infrared, visible, X-rays, these are all very well established for thousands of years, hundreds of years in the case of X-rays, in order to produce radiation in these areas. But terahertz is not. This is a 1 terahertz frequency. This is power output, the photonics approach, and the electronics approach. And you can see that the power output gets lower as we approach what we call the terahertz gap. So this is very difficult, cutting edge technology. What are the natural sources of terahertz radiation? You remember that quote I said from Immanuel Kant? Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the starry heavens above and the moral law within. So what I mean to say is that there's a natural terahertz coming from the sky, that's the starry heavens above, from the cosmic microwave background. Many of you are familiar with the Big Bang and the origins of the universe, and there is a buzz out there, as it were, a kind of background microwave noise that we call the cosmic microwave background. Is the remnant, the energetic remnant of that Big Bang. But that is a black body. In other words, it has a variety of frequencies, and there's a small portion of it that's actually in the terahertz. And then this painting is meant to depict that people or living organisms also emit terahertz radiation. So the starry heavens above and the moral law within. So the New York City Police Department uses this sort of concept to detect weapons at a distance. So there are security applications. So this is a terahertz detector, and the person is emitting terahertz because they're made of proteins, as I mentioned, but a concealed weapon like a gun or a knife is made of metal, it's not made of proteins, so it will appear as a contrast underneath the clothing of this person. And this is the same concept used in airports in some screening, where you raise your arms, and these are called millimeter wave scanner, and it's a very similar concept. So you can think of the airport scanner as a very primitive, simple, early kind of medical imaging. Obviously, they're looking for weapons, but just like X-rays, there's a different sort of energy. So there are two technical challenges: terahertz sources of sufficient power and spectral resolution. There are all sorts of different approaches to this. And of course, water absorption is an opportunity and a challenge. The water is a hydrogen bonded network. It's in effect a macromolecule that's also vibrating, just like proteins. So they have their absorption in the terahertz range. So what are the principles of terahertz medicine? A diagnosis, we can do imaging, structural, and spectroscopy, looking at specific proteins or specific constituents. So we combine structural and functional imaging and spectroscopy. And then energy-based treatment based on those frequencies to influence particular proteins. And that's what I call the future energy on matter paradigm. So the three principles of terahertz medicine are resonance on the targets, localization, specific area of the body, and targets that have some functional significance. So if we think about the virus, the COVID-19, it has a spike protein. That protein has a specific dynamics. It can be localized to different parts of the body, or it can be localized on a surface, and it has a function. That function of the spike protein is to bind to a target protein. So if we can influence the vibrations of that spike protein, that would be one way of inactivating the virus. And I'll talk about this more. Obviously, there are other applications. So the optimal targets in terahertz medicine are proteins with significant charges and dipoles and significant large-scale motions involving their function. we call this electrodynamically active. So these are typically allosteric regulatory proteins, ion channels like the potassium channel I showed you, signal transduction proteins, transcription factors, and so forth. So these are all typical drug targets, are likely to be optimal targets also for an electromagnetic approach. So for example, this transport protein that we talked about, the voltage-dependent potassium channel, it has a lot of charges related to it. It has a big motion. There's likely to be a significant electromagnetic signature related to this protein, either for diagnostic purposes or for therapeutic purposes to influence that function. So let's talk a little bit about some research results. This is not a research seminar, but I'll give you some background related in general, as well as with COVID-19. So one of these is some protein spectroscopy and other studies. The Open Innovation Program that I worked on when I was at Samsung and serves very similar to what CREST in Malaysia is doing in terms of bringing different members of the ecosystem together. Some studies on the terahertz imaging of cancer, terahertz imaging of Alzheimer's disease, two-dimensional terahertz spectroscopy, and an integrated terahertz source and sensor with some conclusions. Many of these studies were done in collaboration with Hanyang University, the Ohio State University, MIT, and UC Irvine in California. So one concept to bear in mind is the difference between time domain and frequency domain spectroscopy. Some of you are not technical physicists, but roughly speaking, time domain spectroscopy is the principle used in NMR or MRI, where you do a wide range of frequencies and sample all the frequencies at once. We call that time domain. Frequency domain measurements would be more like specific frequencies, one by one. That would be like in the thermometer that you do for infrared, you sample at a particular frequency. So time domain and frequency domain measurements. Now the reason I mention this is that most experiments in physics in terahertz are done in the time domain, and in biomedical applications, the more useful experiment is in the frequency domain. You can imagine many proteins with different frequencies. If you do the time domain, then you will confuse the whole picture. So that's one characteristic of the field that we need to overcome. So the initial studies I want to show you are related to myoglobin and hemoglobin. They are oxygen storage and oxygen transport proteins respectively. This was done at the Samsung Advanced Institute of Technology, Hanyang University at the Pohang Accelerator Lab in Korea. This is set up, you can see it's quite complex. The laser comes in and the optical beams are reflected and so forth along this optical table. This is the sample box. The sample box is here. You pull out the water, you reduce the height, the water content, and so forth. So we got a basic result here with hemoglobin and a myoglobin that we'll show, and we presented those results in a number of conferences. So this is the comparison of myoglobin and hemoglobin. Hemoglobin bovine from the cow in red, hemoglobin human in blue, myoglobin in green. And the basic concept using this time domain spectroscopy is we saw differences between myoglobin and hemoglobin. We saw species specificity differences between cow and human hemoglobin. They're very similar proteins, but actually we can detect a spectroscopic difference. We also saw what's called a Stokes shift or emission, absorption at the high frequency, high energy, and the protein pumps out energy at lower frequency, lower energy. This was not a artifact. We see a real resonance. The blue you can see is an artifact. These are real results, and you can see that the 450 gigahertz that we saw with the previous inelastic neutron scattering was also replicated with myoglobin and hemoglobin here, 450 gigahertz. And that's the comparison that I mentioned, that previous paper with Martin Karplus and Jeremy Smith with the inelastic neutron scattering, 450 gigahertz approximate frequency. So the conclusions are broad yet specific low frequency absorption. We can differentiate between very similar proteins, and the globin folds show similar frequency features, but with some differences, and then we saw possible stimulated emission with proteins as terahertz emitters at low frequency. Now, you might have said that those results were not so impressive, the spectrum was kind of soft, etc. But sharp protein resonances exist, and I don't want to go into the technical details, but this is a study out of Buffalo, Andrea Markel's with the lysozyme, another very important protein, shows a sharp resonance at 1.5 terahertz. And these motions actually change with biological functions. This is the same lysozyme. This is the motion, the hinging motion, the transition dipole in one direction. This is the same lysozyme with an inhibitor or a drug, and you can see the motion has changed with another direction and a twisting motion. So a hinge motion shifts to a twisting motion when you bind the drug to it. So imagine that instead of binding the drug, we can influence those motions electromagnetically and hence influence the function of the protein electromagnetically. So cancer and protein electrodynamics, we have proteins involved in different proteins are involved in cancer, obviously. So this is a SARC protein. Some of you who are in oncology can recognize this. This is a what we call an oncogene or oncoprotein. This red is a heat map of the motion. The wild type is the normal protein. The one on the right is the mutated protein. And so different proteins, when they're normal and cancerous, have different motional characteristics. So when I was at Samsung, I arranged several projects to come together in an open innovation program. The Ohio State project, which I'll talk about, using this principle with cancer diagnosis. MIT to do 2D terahertz spectroscopy to help define those features. Therapeutics at the University of Southampton, and using a silicon-based integrated system at UC Irvine. So we did a experiment with terahertz imaging of cancer, which we've published a couple of times. One is showing differences between cancerous and normal tissue. We also did a similar study with amyloidosis and Alzheimer's disease. And we did, again, time domain spectroscopy. This is the setup. This is the light microscopy. This is the terahertz image. And we can tell Alzheimer's disease from control tissues. As I mentioned at MIT, in order to get more specific spectroscopy, we did 2D spectroscopy. This was with Keith Nelson, and submitted and were granted a US patent for that. And as I mentioned, on the electronic side, you can go up from electronics and create terahertz and also terahertz sensors. And this was a chip designed by Payam Haidari at the University of Irvine that we helped fund that study. And this is a 300 gigahertz frequency synthesizer on a chip, so this can be highly miniaturized. We also did a similar, supported similar work at the University of Texas, Dallas with Kenneth O. And the concept is you can have a handheld system that can be used for diagnosis and potentially treatment. So finally, can one modulate protein function via terahertz? Can we change proteins via this terahertz? There's a recent study produced out of Japan, June 2nd of this year, terahertz irradiation changing the structure of actin. This is actin, which is a protein involved in motion, muscles. And you can see that under the electron microscopy that these networks have been changed through terahertz, and they subtracted out the heating effect. But it's still an open question. So the overall conclusion, terahertz interacts with proteins, definite signals observed, continuous wave or frequency domain spectroscopy might be better for this purpose. We can also distinguish different tissues, normal and diseased. We can use this for imaging, we can use it for spectroscopy, and we need to improve the technology. But miniaturization by silicon-based CMOS platforms is a possibility, and this is why this is very much related to Malaysia's strengths in semiconductor technology and CREST in particular in creating a new paradigm for medicine. There's some issues with water penetration. I'm not going to go into the technical details here, but we can focus on the range where water is penetrated less. We can also use specific frequencies or tunability, the frequency domain, as I mentioned, to achieve penetration in water windows. We can also use pulse radiation, short pulses. as well as higher power. Based on the biology back to physics, we have, as I mentioned, two types of approaches, electronics and photonics. The photonic sources are both time domain. The vacuum electronic sources are also time domain. So the most promising approach is probably going to be the solid state, as I mentioned, CMOS approach. And the future of medicine is very much around this integration or convergence. And so this is surgical technology, this is drugs, this is radiation therapy, this is imaging, this is matter, this is energy. So protein electrodynamics and terahertz medicine is very much a convergence concept. So I'll end the next few minutes with some applications. Why new medicine? What are the potential applications? Terahertz light switch, cancer, antibiotic resistance, how new paradigms for COVID-19, and some final conclusions. So we fundamentally need a new approach to diagnosis and treatment. I showed you this slide about medical imaging. I showed you this slide about biopharma innovation. I showed you this slide about how technology evolves. Eventually will be an energy on matter paradigm. So energy on matter will be the future paradigm of medicine. Greater specificity, more non-invasive, greater effectiveness, lower cost, more rapid therapy development. We're still waiting for antivirals. We could potentially do this much faster, and a convergence of medicine and surgery, as I described. So this new medicine in terms of electromagnetic medicine is increasing. We see Time Magazine, we see Google combining with drug companies, we see research efforts increasing around the world. What are the potential applications? Cancer, infectious disease, neuroscience, diabetes, and more. It's a platform technology. So one possible experiment is a terahertz light switch. Most of you are familiar with bioluminescence, with jellyfish and fireflies. Imagine if you can just turn that on and off, the visual thing, switch with a terahertz control. Cancer and microtubules. Taxol is a very powerful anti-cancer drug, but it has very high side effects given systemically. So Taxol acts on microtubules, which are proteins that are involved in cell division. Those proteins have their dynamics. If you can influence those electromagnetically, that would be a universal cancer treatment. We have novel, low-cost resistant antibiotic therapy. We've been talking about pandemics, but another big era is the post-antibiotic era where we have bacterial infections that cannot be treated by antibiotics. And it takes years to develop a new antibiotic. So imagine instead if we can have some way of zapping those bacteria, they're key proteins, right? And if they mutate and have a slightly different frequency, then we basically adjust those frequencies, and the development cycle for developing drugs that act on these mutated forms will be much faster. So at Institut Pasteur in Korea, we've discussed the possibility of doing drug screening, and instead of drug screening, we use terahertz screening to isolate phenotypically relevant targets. Now, we mentioned about the handheld thermal scanner for testing temperature. Imagine a handheld COVID scanner. So instead of doing a nasal swab or a blood test, you can just shine an instrument and you say, oh, there's the spike protein there. So this is a project that we are doing at Middle Eastern Technical University with Professor Hakan Altan, my collaborator Min Sok Kim, surf-enhanced plasmonic terahertz absorption to identify biological molecules, and we are looking at SARS-CoV-2 as a potential real-time, at a distance detector of COVID virus.
Prof, you have 2 more minutes, Prof?
Yeah, we're finishing up, thank you.
All right.
And remember, we had some technical glitches because I was starting early.
Yes,
I appreciate your consideration.
Yeah.
So I had to jump in. So there are also medical and military applications. If you can modulate protein function for medical purposes, you can also use it for military purposes. Now, obviously, that's not the purpose of today's discussion, but terahertz electronics research for defense, mostly focused on battlefield sensing and communications, but also there are some weapons possibilities. So some of you may remember President Trump talking about some very controversial things, electromagnetic. He didn't talk about this, but if you listen to his press conference 1 second.
Very interesting. So supposing we hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light, and I think you said that hasn't been checked, but you're going to test it. And then I said, supposing you brought the light inside the body, which you can do either through the skin or in some other way. And I think you said you're going to test that too. Sounds interesting. Right, and then I see the disinfectant.
So my point is, could you hear that?
Yes, we heard that.
Okay, so obviously that was very controversial. A lot of people were saying things, and I'm not trying to be political, whether I support or not. But I thought that was very interesting because I imagined President Trump was giving away some very significant national security secrets, because he probably received a national security briefing that related to this type of radiation being used for weapons. And of course, the economy is going bad and people are dying. And he said, maybe we can repurpose this for COVID. And President Trump, you know, in his way, kind of simplifying and maybe not fully understanding, was mentioning that. So that was a very interesting press conference. And those sorts of things are potentially in development. Obviously, you know, not more details from there. So terahertz physics has been increasing interest, industrial and medical. The technology has improved a lot, the cost has decreased. You've heard about Star Trek being a predictor of technology, the communicator leading to the mobile phone, the tricorder leading ultimately to some kind of quadcorder, a handheld device for diagnosis, but even more for treatment. So this is more than just about technology. It's a whole paradigm shift. I've also written a novel about it. This is basically the literary exposition of this idea that also explores the social dimensions. This is the voltage-gated potassium channel that I mentioned. It's actually mentioned in chapter 19 as one of the applications. So some closing thoughts. Protein molecules are the machinery of life. They're solid, not solid, but they're vibrating. They have charges, so they can emit and absorb energy. Proteins are like radios, leading to protein electrodynamics, leading to an entirely new approach to diagnosis and therapy, which is terahertz medicine. I've presented this around the world, in the United States, in Europe, in Australia, and of course in Asia. And it's my pleasure to present it here. I believe this is the future of medicine, and I believe there are significant possibilities for COVID-19 in the not too far distant future, which we are also working on. So finally, Isaac Newton, who is a founder of physics, modern physics, as all of you know, he describes this electric and elastic spirit in the context of biology, which he was very interested in. Another hero of mine is Richard Feynman in his lectures on physics. Everything that living things do can be understood in terms of the jigglings and wigglings of atoms. And I met with Martin Karplus and gave a presentation on this at his Nobel Prize Symposium. Proteins are neither a solid nor liquid. They are something in between, as he told me. And I asked him after my seminar, what would you suggest? I would do the experiment on an enzyme. If it works, it would be significant. So in the beginning, technology is not always pretty, but dreams can fly, and moonshots as well as Mars shots are possible. I thank you very much. I can be reached on LinkedIn and also by email, ogangurel@gmail.com. Sorry that I'm a little bit late. We had a little bit of a technical issue we had to jump into, but I appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate your listening, and I think we solved it. Thank you, Dr. Allaudin.
Thank you, Prof, for sharing with us the new paradigm in medicine and healthcare. For those who would like to ask for any questions, you can post it on the question and answer chat box. Prof, there's 2 questions that has come in through email. Perhaps if you could take this. In the past, the South Korea regulation prohibits the monitoring of health vital signs via IoT and smartphone devices. What is the current status?
Yes, well, actually, so that doesn't relate to terahertz medicine, but more with South Korea. actually telemedicine is illegal in Korea. And so even though Korea is very technologically advanced and we have a lot of digital healthcare companies, or at least technology, the actual practice of digital healthcare is not possible in Korea. And there are essentially two reasons for that. One is that Korea is, one is a, how should I say, social reason, the other one is a market reason. The market reason is Korea actually has a very good healthcare system with a very good access. It's a very geographically small country, and there are doctors everywhere, and there are a few rural areas that is more difficult, but in general, I would say 95% of the population is 5 minutes away from a doctor. I know that's hard to believe, but or maybe 15 minutes away. So telemedicine really doesn't have a market value proposition. The legal reason or social reason is all those doctors that are spread around are concerned that they'll lose their patients to the top academic medical centers if telemedicine is a possibility. Everybody wants to go to the top center instead of going to the neighborhood doctor. So I think, although as a doctor, I believe that having that access and going to your neighborhood doctor is also related to very good quality care, not just going to the academic centers. So for those two major reasons, telemedicine and what you mentioned about the information and IoT are very problematic and in some cases not legal. I don't think that's the case with Malaysia. I think Malaysia is more geographically dispersed. I'm not talking about good or bad healthcare. I just think that it is a much bigger country and more geographically dispersed country than South Korea. So I think that the value proposition and the need for this type of technology is much greater in Malaysia or other countries, Indonesia, Australia, United States, etc. But in Korea, there's not as much of a need. That's the answer to that question.
I have two more questions that has come in. Thank you for your new information. In conclusion, do we want to capture frequency released by protein from coronavirus in infected body?
Yeah, I think, you know, looking off into the future, I think that this is a possibility. The virus, as I mentioned at the beginning, has specific proteins that are unique to it. They should have some spectral uniqueness that can be used either for diagnostic purposes, as I mentioned, to pick up those frequencies and hence detect the virus, not just on the body, but on surfaces, for example. So diagnostically, but as I also implied, one could also inactivate the virus. This is what President Trump perhaps was, you know, vaguely hinting at. We could inactivate the virus electromagnetically by inactivating those proteins on its surface. So that's also an area of great interest. Whether we inactivate it on surfaces, of course, you could do that with bleach and alcohol, as I mentioned, simple, you don't need fancy technology, or inactivate that in the body. That's what I think President Trump was hinting at by putting, you know, high energy or intense light that was probably simplified for him because he's not a scientist, but my guess is that's what they were considering. Because of course, ultraviolet light is dangerous in the body, so that's not an option. Yeah. But the terahertz is not ionizing, so it has an effect on biology, but not like ionizing radiation like ultraviolet or X-rays, which are clearly dangerous.
Thanks, Prof. Thank you for all your knowledge sharing with us. However, due to interest of time, we are unable to take the 2 or 3 more questions. Perhaps,
sure, I understand.
Yeah, perhaps Prof, if you can answer them online, that would be great. And we'll be also sharing the recording to the others. So with that, let's thank Prof. Ogan Gurel, and thank you again. Thanks, Prof.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. Glad we could fix the problem.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we will move on to Dr. Kuldeep. Dr. Kuldeep, sorry about the technical glitches. Are you okay there? You ready?
Yeah, I'm already here.
Okay, I think I will just quickly, briefly introduce you again. Dr. Kuldeep Kaur is the Hospital Director of Sungai Buloh Hospital, the main admitting hospital for COVID-19. And Dr. Kuldeep is well respected as an hospital administrator and has held various leadership roles in hospital administration. It's a pleasure for us today to hear her on the strategies in the pandemic preparedness as COVID-19 hospital. To you, Dr. Kuldeep.
Thank you, Dr. Fazilah. I'll quickly move on. As we all know, in Malaysia, the first 3 cases were detected on the 25th January 2020. I'm going to start on right away, and hence from there, Ministry of Health declared Sungai Buloh Hospital as COVID-19 hospital for Klang Valley as of 12 March 2020. Sungai Buloh, as any other hospital, is a secondary and a tertiary hospital. It's started off with in 2006 with 620 bedded multidisciplinary specialist hospital. It's the center of infectious disease in the country and also the center of excellence of other specialties like spine and trauma and cornea and also upper GI. So being a secondary and a tertiary, or rather having center of excellence for certain specialties or subspecialties, it's a very busy hospital in the Klang Valley, and the BOR is more than 85%. In addition to that, we also have another hospital which is under Hospital Sungai Buloh, our old leprosy center, as a satellite facility. So during the COVID-19 time, we were lucky because we had 3 areas that we could use. One was Hospital Sungai Buloh itself, where our main building is there. And under Hospital Sungai Buloh, we had leprosy center, which is at the point of COVID-19, we have actually opened up to 403 beds. And next to our leprosy center, there's also a training center, which is has got about 4 blocks, and total patients, or rather patients that can be accommodated there, can be up to 2,400 patients. So as we can see, it was an unprecedented event. So we had to really learn fast and see how we can actually prepare ourselves almost soon to keep at pace with the COVID-19 disease. So in short, management kept a fast pace of learning, adopting and adapting on an hourly basis. Being an unprecedented level of cooperation and common purpose that is for COVID-19, we rose above ourselves and dedicated itself to humanity cause of delivering the care to all patients, COVID-19 patients. So things were moving too fast, changing environment, everything was not actually applicable at that point of time because there was nothing that we could refer to other than our past experience in H1N1 and also MERS-CoV. So I may say that the success is attributed to relentless direction carried out by tireless teamwork to build COVID-19 emergency preparedness, which was unprecedented in Malaysia. This was the pre-COVID-19 Sungai Buloh Hospital organization structure, where we have medical directorate, surgical directorate, clinical support directorate, and the management directorate. So the main objective was to implement changes in Hospital Sungai Buloh as to prepare the hospital for managing COVID-19 cases in Malaysia. We based on certain approaches for H1N1 pandemic and MERS-CoV epidemic, hospital management developed a COVID-19 pandemic preparedness strategy following the 6 perspectives. These were some of the tools that were used by other countries to prepare for this COVID-19. We just had a glance at it, and of course, if we could use it, we would definitely adopt and adapt. Okay, coming to Malaysia, in Hospital Sungai Buloh, what we did was making sure that we could get a meeting with all the head of departments in the hospital to actually share from our infectious disease consultants to share with all the head of departments regards to how COVID-19 was going, and with the support from all head of departments and shifting from department response to hospital response and eventually to infectious disease response, was the actually gave us a lot of confidence that we could move this. Number two, our second strategy was actually, maybe I should just mention a little bit about the first strategy, a bit more about the first strategy. So basically, in the first strategy, communication between the infectious disease clinicians with the screening centers, nursing and bed management unit, critical care and laboratory helped us in facilitation of all the tasks that was required for COVID-19 management and updates. So facilitation of these tasks included updating of resources was successfully driven, establishing a 24-hour task force. We opened up a crisis preparedness and response center on the 9th of March to make sure that the task force was actually selected from the hospital admin, infection control, quality units and CRC and bed management units. All the information that was collected was actually relayed to other authorities within the state and Ministry of Health. And we also thought of our non-COVID patients because we had to move them out. So we thought of them, and we had made networking and arrangement with other semi-government hospitals nearby, enable for provision of non-COVID patients for emergency services requiring intensive care backup. So finally, we led ourselves into a flat organization structure which eased our daily routines of the hospital administration for COVID-19 management. So Sungai Buloh, being a dedicated center for infectious disease and trauma, involving many subspecialties, so we can imagine how scaling down was possible. It is such a busy hospital. So scaling down these services for COVID-19 crisis was extremely challenging. The scaling down was done immediately to reduce elective procedures and minimize the usage of operating theaters and ICU beds. This stage was followed by only allowing emergency cases that did not require the ICU beds. Finally, scaling down progressed into temporary cessation of all electives and emergency cases, which were decanted to nearby hospitals through specialist to specialist referral. The women and children services were very challenging as they also follow the same decanting process, but being a hospital with the highest delivery rate in Selangor, with approximately 1,000 deliveries per month in Klang Valley, the process of decanting was very challenging, and it took several weeks as others receiving hospitals in Klang Valley were yet to be equipped to receive these cases immediately. Nevertheless, this resulted in we may manage to do it, but over some time, and slowly but surely we managed to do it. There were other services also that required attention. That is, the laboratory department was also activated at full capacity for search of COVID-19 cases. All COVID-19 samples were exclusively investigated in Sungai Buloh Hospital and processed by using the RT-PCR based on the Ministry of Health policy. However, few samples at that point of time required reconfirmation were processed in collaboration with other institute like Institute Medical Research, and other services in terms of psychological first aid were also started for mental and behavioral health support, were established to provide continuous care to the healthcare worker and patients by the psychiatry department. So if you can see that it was a very challenging feat for us, because all specialist outpatient areas were scaled down, and we had to immediately send our non-COVID patients to be actually managed in other hospitals around in Klang Valley. Our inpatient clinical services, stabilizing inpatient clinical services and decanting of inpatient clinical services via specialist to specialist referral to all surrounding hospitals who stood on to take on our patients, our non-COVID patients, was very challenging, because they themselves, the other hospitals itself, had BOR of also as high as us, and they were actually trying to manage to see how to take in these patients to allow us to manage the COVID patients. So expansion of ID and critical care services, because of this scaling down of the electives and decanting patients, and managing our emergency department, taking in patients for green and yellow, and decreasing the number of green and yellow and semi-emergencies, helped us in expanding our ID and critical care services. So preparation of hospital response for all critical care services to be into accepting COVID-19 cases, which involve preparation of specialist and intensive care beds. This was assisted because we were able to scale down and decant our cases to the neighboring hospitals. So next was scaling down specialist outpatient clinic services. We did this because we had to reduce infection rate and mobilize all our resources into COVID-19 care. We pool all our resources to be used for, or to be trained and to be mobilized under COVID-19 patient care throughout the hospital. Of course, when we became a flat organization, everything was under the control of the hospital management, and therefore we could request for greater budget and also pool our human resource together, and equipment and facilities and management all came under the hospital response. And therefore, with our crisis preparedness and response center, data availability was there for us to actually go accordingly and see how much resources are required, whether it was in the term of PPE, or whether it was the equipment, whether it was the budget or the human resource management, or even preparing the facility in terms of barriers, and preparing the facility in terms of the need for managing the COVID-19 patients. Direct control resources for both medical and non-medical were equally critical during this COVID-19 crisis. So maximizing existing budget, including the national disaster budget for purchasing equipment, example mechanical ventilators and PPEs for frontliners, became a priority. So the pharmacy and the finance department were put in charge for this crucial role in purchasing and controlling this essential item. A strict control for the release of PPE was also implemented. The hospital logistic and transportation were divided into patient, staff, and general transportation. COVID-19 patients were transferred by using dedicated ambulance, both at the intra-hospital and inter-hospital transfers. The transport for staffs were also provided via bus and vans. The general logistic lorries for transport to different locations of the ward were also mobilized. So our human resource, our frontliners were manned by medical officers and allied health staffs who were under the hospital admin. All clinicians and allied health staffs were given full training by the occupational safety and health and infection control teams on proper usage, donning and doffing of PPE. Special operating teams were trained with powered air purifying respirator, PAPR, according to each surgical base specialties to operate on COVID-19 cases. So a lot of COVID-19 contingency plans were planned in every department to take on COVID-19 patients when we receive patients in the different specialties. Accommodation was also provided to the frontliners on a needs basis. Adequate meals were provided by the dietetic for both healthcare workers and patients to cater for meal demands for the initial starting and throughout the whole COVID-19 management period. Same challenges we had in other areas also, in the IT areas, because we are a fully IT hospital. So we had to cater for the demand, which was beyond our numbers, earlier numbers before pre-COVID time. And other challenges were also overall security of the hospital were also taken into consideration for both staff and patient management. As we know, this is something unprecedented and is new. There was a lot of fear, there was a lot of fright, and even some patients were finding chances to escape, and we had to do so much to make sure our security was well manned. And at this point of COVID-19 period, we had a function that was unusual. We were not only functioning as a hospital, but we were also functioning as something like, they call it like a hotel, because patients came in and they were shocked that they were not able to go back because they were actually, they need to be in the hospital, otherwise they would breach the infection prevention control policy. And the same time, they would need to be quarantined for a period of time. So therefore, they were actually surprised, and they had a lot of fear. So the hospital medical dental advisory committee restructured the pre-COVID management into a flat hospital organization structure based on the need of the COVID-19 crisis. So we have actually set up in the 3 different areas of our facility, in main hospital Sungai Buloh, in leprosy center, and in the training center, which is all around the same compound. We have actually set up committees to make sure all the different areas are manned by leaders, and all of them reported to me, and daily we would have meetings to iron out our issues and problems that we face as we went along. So this was the hospital COVID-19 hospital response organization. It's a flat organization where everybody reported to the central, that is the hospital, and it is all, we all had to work as a team. Its communication was very important. It was on a daily basis, sometimes on an hourly basis, until we reach some decision. So totally we had more than over 2,000 beds which was functioning at that point of time, and we treated more than 1/3 of patients in this hospital. So pre-COVID ICU, we had only 42 functioning beds. During COVID-19, because of our scaling down of our services, our decanting of totally, finally at the end, we managed to decant even the emergency services to nearby universities and hospitals. We managed to get 108 ICU bed. Our capacity was 108. So at the same time, we also needed to ensure there is an uninterrupted oxygen supply which was increased from alternate day to daily supply. ICU facilities were revamped to makeshift green zone by blocking supply from the main ICU and making sure the clean air and the dirty air do not mix. So therefore, to take care of our healthcare workers in the green zones. So if you can see, we Hospital Sungai Buloh comparatively throughout, we have managed more than 1/3 of patients in the whole of Malaysia, and our admission and discharges, as we can see, and our mortality was one of the least mortality in our hospital in Sungai Buloh. So hospitals worldwide will be challenged by having shortage of bed and reduced resources during COVID-19 pandemic. But we have managed it in such a way that we have a lot of backup and a lot of help from Ministry of Health and our state of Selangor. And we were lucky that we were fully supported by Ministry of Health, by our state Selangor, and we overcome we prepared our hospital using the 6 strategies to overcome these challenges, and managed to provide excellent healthcare service for our COVID-19 patients. Training, as I said, it went on and on daily. We daily trained our healthcare staff for donning and doffing in preparation to be managing the COVID-19 patients in the wards, in the ICU, and that was ongoing, like almost daily basis, to making sure refresher courses were also given to them, and daily reminders were given to them, and we made sure our resources were kept to the optimal level to take care of our healthcare workers. Nevertheless, of course, we had some infection in the hospital, but we overcome it soon enough, and we came out with a vigilante committee, which actually was walking around to making sure and reminding each and every staff in the different areas, especially in the pantries and in the OTs, to making sure that they follow the SOP strictly in wearing the mask, and also sanitizing and avoiding crowded places and confined places. And this was actually almost done daily. And our vigilante committee, which was actually headed by our one of our head of departments, with few head of departments in the committee, were actually walking around in the different areas of the hospital to making sure daily that the SOPs are followed. So finally, I must say that good teamwork and a flat organization structure with pooling of resources and resources kept at optimal level and continuous manpower training are the key elements for hospital preparedness of COVID-19 pandemic. As I said earlier, our hospital is a secondary and tertiary hospital like any other hospital. It was not planned to actually take up COVID-19 patients almost immediately, but it was repurposed and made to fit for the COVID-19. We had actually come out with some barriers according to COVID-19 disease. So we have come out with some barriers, and we had used a lot of telephones for communications with our patients, to also making sure that our healthcare staffs are not directly exposed, and made sure that our healthcare staffs are properly trained in managing the patients, and and making sure the safety of our healthcare staff all the time. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kuldeep, for sharing with us your journey. And I'm sure you must have gone through an extreme situation with high level of uncertainty and stress. I have some questions here that was posted. Question number 1. How are you catching up with the backlog, as you have done a lot of scaling down in the last 5 months?
Well, that's a good question, very good question. Okay, we are actually slowly but surely we have come back to hybrid. We have come back to hybrid. So we are trying to look if when it comes to elective cases, what my consultants have done. They have sort of screen and see who needs an earlier appointment compared to the rest. And of course, the stable patients, we are handling them online. So we are using different strategies to making sure that we are going to cope with the backlog. So one of them is online with the stable patients. The other one is to bring back patients according to appointment, slowly but surely, but looking at the status of the patient, which needs an earlier coming in to see us face to face. And we have also extended, we thought of actually looking at shift strategy in certain departments, like the ID department. They look at shift work to work till at, I think it's 8 o'clock, if I'm not mistaken, 8 o'clock in the night, to bring in those cases to come in to see us, especially those in the clinics. So that is one of the ways we have looked at it so far. So far, much more discussions are going on how to assist our patients which are pending till today.
I'm sure there's a lot more work post-pandemic, am I right, Dr. Kuldeep?
Yeah.
Okay, I have one more question here. What will you do differently if you have to do this all over again? I really hope you don't have to do this all over again, but you can try answering this question.
Yeah, sure. I think if I have to do it all over again, I think what I'll suggest is the hospital, being a center of excellence for infectious disease, need to be prepared in terms of the facility. So therefore, I would not wait to advise this in terms of Hospital Sungai Buloh. We need to have enough negative pressure rooms, isolation rooms, which are well equipped for this kind of pandemic at a large scale. I would think that the hospital, learning from this pandemic, should prepare itself if ever we have to face this again, in terms of the infrastructure. The human resource should be properly trained for critical care areas, and infrastructure must be prepared both in the engineering aspects or in the space aspects. Being an infectious disease hospital and being a hospital that's going to face the first brunt of any pandemic, I think the hospital need to be very much prepared.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Kuldeep. Thanks again.
Thank you
so I think thank you to everyone. We have come to the end of day 2, morning session of Symposium 2 and Plenary 4. I would like to thank to all our 3 speakers, Dr. Chu Cheng Hoon, Prof. Ogan Gurel, and also Dr. Kuldeep Kaur. With that, thank you all. Thank you to all our participants, our speakers, and hope you have had a fruitful day too. Until we meet again, goodbye.